Hey everyone. I wanted to make a quick video and just make an announcement that I'm going to be working on a kind of blog article series, and it's going to be called Interpreting the Bible. Part one is out already, so I just wanted you guys to know that. I wanted to give you a heads up. And actually, part one is really on this idea of literal interpretation, and what that is, literal meaning, and how we should understand literal meaning. And so if you guys go to the website, joshsummer.org, you'll see that part one is there. In the next part, I want to talk about typology. But just to kind of give a synopsis or a summary of the first part, the idea of literal meaning has been distorted or skewed over the years, especially within the last, I don't know, 100 years or so. I would say even 200 years maybe. The idea of literal interpretation has been seriously twisted, I believe, and a lot of honest Bible-believing Christians have been taught that twisted view of literal interpretation. And basically, what I try to get at in the first part, in this first article, is that Scripture always communicates literal truth, but it doesn't always communicate literal truth by virtue of literal means, or through literal means. So, for example, in Psalm 102, that's the chief example that I use, is Psalm 102, verse 25, where it says, "The heavens are the work of your hands." The Bible is not telling us that God has actual, literal, anatomical hands. It is telling us something literal about God, but it's not using literal means to tell us that literal thing about God. Does that make sense? So it's communicating a literal truth through other than literal language. Okay, it's communicating, and more specifically, you might say it's communicating literal truth through an anthropomorphism or a metaphor, even, you might say, right? So it's not communicating literal truth through literal or univocal language. Okay, it's communicating the literal truth through other than literal terms. And in the next article, I want to talk about typology, using Galatians 4, for example, where Paul uses two literal women, historical women who really lived, Sarah and Hagar, as symbols or allegories. Actually, more literally and more woodenly in the Greek, it's allegories. Sarah and Hagar may be understood allegorically, Paul says, and so and you know, Sarah and Hagar, I think in that instance, Paul is seeing them as types, and so I want to talk about the idea of typology. This idea that something that is a historical event is being used by God in his providence to point to something that is other and greater. And oftentimes the dynamic between types and their antitypes are, one is earthly and the other is heavenly. And so I want to get into that in the second part. And then just kind of as we go, I don't know how many parts I will do. But I just kind of want to make this announcement. I don't want to be a super long video. Interpreting the Bible is very, very important. And, in all the discussion, on theology proper, and you can see where hermeneutics have led men astray. A faulty hermeneutic has led men astray in terms of talking about God rightly. And I think you see that in John Frame and Scott Oliphant. They have this univocal understanding of Scripture. Scripture is always speaking in univocal terms. In other words, the assumption behind it is that the Bible cannot communicate literal truth through anything other than literal means. But that's a false assumption, and the Bible teaches us that that's a false assumption. And so hermeneutics is very important in this discussion on covenants. The biblical covenants. We need to understand this idea of typology that kind of undergirds our understanding of God's covenant and these subservient covenants and what they're pointing forward to, something other and greater than themselves, something more ultimate, something more foundational. And so I think it'll be useful, and hopefully you guys will gather much from it, glean much from it. So if you wouldn't mind getting on there, reading it, if it's helpful to you, please go ahead and share it on your social media accounts. Again, that's joshsummer.org. God bless you guys. Have a good rest of your day.